can't believe I have to talk about incest for like 45 minutes.
Studio.
Moshi Moshi, Spasadic Studio here, and welcome on in to our second video essay. I want to thank everybody for watching the first one. Your input means a lot to me. The feedback means a lot to me. It's one of my highest performing videos, which is really nice. So thank you so much. I do have some criticisms of it, like now that it's up. My VTuber eye twitching is really annoying. I think it's because it doesn't understand that my glasses are glasses. Also, I'm trying to improve the audio quality. I'm one person orchestrating this, so I'm learning as I go. But welcome on in as I tell you how Resident Evil ruined my life. Okay, that's not entirely true. I scripted this video last year because I wanted to talk about all the ways that the RE8 design pissed me off specifically, but now that I've deep dived into the lore, I'm having a pretty good time, and I do have a new appreciation for the lords. I'm not big on zombie media. I'm not the biggest fan. It's just not for me, but I am a big vampire fan, and I am a big ball-jointed doll fan, and so I think that this series of videos on RE8 is definitely worth making. With Nosferatu having come out this year, it seems like the perfect time to expound a little bit more on the mythos of vampires, so I'm excited to do that. And yeah, so quick trigger warning, obviously before we start, we're going to be talking about gore, extreme horror, violence against marginalized people, and obviously I'm going to be spoiling things for RE8. If you're late to the party of Resident Evil games, Silent Hill, Bloodborne, or just don't want these random indie games I'm going to talk about as the series goes on spoiled for you, then maybe don't watch this. Because I am pretentious in my waking life, we're going to be talking about Jane Eyre, Dracula, and some classical literature. So I suggest if you don't want that spoiled, go be pretentious on your own and then come back to this video. And final warning, because I know you're going to yell at me, I won't be talking about Ari's gameplay or game mechanics. And I can hear you saying, that's the whole point of the franchise. Wrong. I'm an artiste, and so I'm going to critique the aesthetic much in the way that I took sort of a more tangential approach to the mouthwashing video. We're still going to be looking into lore and character design, and I did play RE8 to make sure that I didn't miss anything that would be glaringly problematic in the gameplay mechanics. But I am an idiot, so it's very possible that I miss a thing or two. But yeah, we're going to do game aestheticism once again. Obviously, these are my opinions. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to think any of these takes are particularly good. I'm going to cite all of the research in the books in the description box, so if I missed something and you want to dunk on me in MLA format, absolutely you can. And with that most giant of disclaimers done, let's talk about how Capcom can catch these hands. So, Chapter 1, Dracula for horny people. In the interest of keeping things sort of comprehensive, we're gonna go down my list of gripes in the order that the lords appear. And so I would be remiss to not first talk about the central draw of Resident Evil 8, which is Mommy Dimitrescu. And I need you to know that for the purpose of this video, I did a lot of research into the early concepts for RE8 because this series of videos was supposed to be basically a comparison between concept art and finished product. But my central thesis here instead is that Resident Evil has compelling ideas, but I believe that the franchise lacks the skill to tell a comprehensive story. And so the ideas seem like the potential is there, but they come across sometimes as vaguely disjointed, with things that should be primary plot points kind of left by the wayside, and zombie go burr at the forefront. And to be fair, like, there's nothing against playing a game for zombie go burr. You don't really have to be uppity and critical of all of the media that you consume all the time. That's just me. I think that RE8 does have a memorable and richly diverse cast of characters. The settings in the game lend themselves to gothic revival, which is hilarious. We'll get to that. You can really feel the insular panic that Mother Miranda's villainy is imparting on Ethan Winters. And that being said, I think that the RE8 team created a gem cast of characters. I love the Lords. I really do. But I think that they had very little idea on how best to employ them to let them reach their maximum potential in the narrative of the game. There are glaring plot holes that I felt could be remedied like really easily if a little bit more care had been given, and there are times where the world building feels extremely lazy. So it's no secret that Dimitrescu's aesthetic is heavily influenced by Dracula, and that's not just because she's a vampire, but because of the thematic backdrop of her appearance. Moreover, there's emphasis on Elizabeth Bathory's legend in her, and I noticed a fun reverse Wives of Bluebeard thing going on. And little interesting side note, the Elizabeth Bathory thing, it was just a hunch for me. I was like, oh, this is very Bathory-esque. And then later through my research, I confirmed that that is what they were going for. So as you can imagine, I'm excited to talk about it. If you're not acquainted with Dracula by Bram Stoker, you don't really have to worry about much other than the big three plot beats in relation to RE8 referencing it. So, Dimitrescu's final form is a dragon. She lives in a vampire castle that the townspeople regard with superstition at its supernatural ability, and she's got some beautiful women who sort of stalk around her abode. Welcome to Crash Course References. So, Bram Stoker comes up with Dracula as modeled on Vlad the Impaler. Dracul specifically means son of the dragon. This is a reference to Vlad Tepes, the Impaler's dad, who is Vlad Dracul. Hence, Mr. Vlad Tepes is the son of a dragon. And if we want to get extra pretentious, it is worth noting that while Stoker doesn't expressly mention Dracula becoming a dragon, Dracula is able to summon storms, which is a thing that Slavic dragon-riding spirits are meant to do in Slavic folklore. Do you think I said Slavic enough? In popular culture, though, Dracula and dragons have become somewhat synonymous, and I know this because longtime Dracula fans can be found on forums all over the internet talking about how you're the idiot if you don't know that dragons and Dracula share connotations. And yeah, I checked. But Dimitrescu's final form, being pretty arguably a dragon, is a fun little nod to one of the many literary references that RE8 likes to allude to. Probably noticed the demon door with the two seals that lets us into the castle, and it's got this guy on it who seems to be devouring a woman. I only registered this during my personal playthrough, but again, it's a fun little nod to the overall otherworldliness that vampires possess. It's also very topical that this is a demon, and we're not going to go too crazy on the biblical connotations of this kind of art because I think that it would be more at home in a different video, but the game calls this door the Maiden and Demon Crest. Something something Goya Saturn devouring his son, something something topical because Mother Miranda sends Ethan to kill her kids. Okay, Dimitrescu lives in a castle. Townspeople are pretty weary of it. She's got 3 beautiful daughters, and this is where RE8 starts to meld 3 very popular vampiric, or at the very least seductively macabre themes that we've seen before in horror together. Firstly, who cares about the daughters being 3? Originally during development, there were supposed to be at least 12 daughters. The castle was meant to be infested with women, as opposed to the occasionally appearing infestation of reject servant girls in the basement. I'm absolutely busting to talk about Elizabeth Bathory, but in an IGN interview, RE's art director Tonomari Takano revealed, quote, "The original castle was populated by women. The concept started out as a castle with 100 witches inside, but that was hard to implement into a video game format." Another less important, but important to me, segment in that interview is that they were supposed to be nude. Apparently the production team had to ask Takano to, quote, bring it back to horror, and I think this lends a lot of credence to the horny posters about the Dimitrescus, if absolutely nothing else. In the Dracula novel, Jonathan Harker comes upon the 3 aforementioned women who are not expressly named, but rather exist as a conglomerate harem known as the Sisters or the Weird Sisters. Jonathan notices that they sort of look like Dracula. He specifically notes the similarity of their noses, quote, high aquiline noses like the Count's. And the Count explains that while he is not in love with them, theoretically he is capable of love, and he wonders if they remember his love from the past. And this is where it's time to play the Sweet Home Transylvania song, because did you know that there's an incestuous underlining plot to Dracula? Well, that's a little unfair to say because it is just a theory, but this was such an insane revelation to read about that I actually borrowed a copy of Dracula from the library and checked to see if I had missed something, because the discourse around this idea of Dracula, a tale of incest, is extremely polarizing online. When Mina becomes turned, Dracula's harem refer to her as sister, and the ambiguous nature of their role, both as a sort of harem, but also as possibly closely related to each other and the Count, makes this word carry a lot more weight, if we're adhering, of course, to the incest theory. There's an insinuation there that aligns with the idea of vampire siring, meaning a vampire making another vampire, being an incestuous process. And a vampire occupying both the role of creator parent and mate is a startling thing to think about when we remove it from literary fiction. It's a real my grandpa is my uncle situation. In 1993, Daniel Lapin published a book called The Vampire Dracula and Incest, and yes, I bought it, and no, it was not cheap. Quick caveat, this book is insane. Like, whatever you're picturing in your head, it descends into even more psychotic territory. I think I said aloud at one point, yelling, "What?" while reading it, because while I love a good reach, this guy is projecting something absolutely not present in Dracula onto Dracula's female cast. Because I'm fair and an equal opportunity hater, we're gonna give it like a slim benefit of the doubt. Some of the connotations that Lapin notices could be applied to Dracula, like how the vampire sire is both mate and child, but he basically inserts the suggestion of CSA whenever he doesn't really jive with a character in Dracula. So when he doesn't like a character, he'll make up scenarios out of nowhere for what I think is shock value. The book is also super unprofessional in tone, which to me, for any informative book, just bounces me right off. He treats most statements with an aha sort of tone that isn't justified for the flimsy or non-existent proof that he provides. Like, I could talk about this book forever, and maybe one day I'll make a video on it, because it really is an exercise in absurdism. In his book, Lapin grapples with the logic of vampire relationships and their real-life connotations. Specifically, he tries to apply the scientific method to vampire siring. And the book is pretty hotly debated from what I saw online, and I think that that's for good reason. People either blindly go along with it, although I don't see how you could, aside for as like a meme, because the association with vampire and sex is something that we really like to lean into. Or on the other hand, they call it a load of baloney. I'm in that camp, personally, and say that Lapin is grasping at straws, and I think that he is grasping at straws. Bro's comeback for everything that's clearly made up in relation to CSA and Dracula is basically just, well, it wasn't canon to Stoker's life because he won't admit that it happened, which is a fancy way of saying
sources that I made it the fuck up.
The book's critics have pointed out its own absurdity, with people contending that even if Bram Stoker was unconsciously writing about CSA in Dracula, there was no evidence that him nor his siblings had ever actually suffered through any CSA at all. And so the main takeaway, without this video turning into a book report about this insane man being a maniac, is that Dracula is meant to be an abusive figure. And for that revelation on Lapin's part, yeah, absolutely, I'll give him a point. Seen through the lens of the helpless and innocent, with a specific emphasis on how women see and experience male oppression, Dracula can absolutely be read as a story about the different types of normalized violence and gaslighting of age, marriable women in Bram Stoker's society. If we meditate a little more on the Maiden and Demon Crest in RE8, this is a depiction of that bias, the oppression of women who would be entering the marriable age. There's a reason that even when highlighting the disgusting, morally perverse nature of vampiric sensuality, the stories tend to center young women, virgins, maidens, young and beautiful, corrupted or otherwise made into walking corpses, being subjugated to the affections of a sometimes literally rotting old monster. And this is the thesis, I think, of Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, the uncomfortable and unglamorous aspect of women being seduced, abducted, owned, usually by magical force, by literal stinking, rotting corpses. And it's also not lost on me that Dimitrescu is officially based on the Hachi Shakusama, or the 8-foot-tall woman of Japanese folklore. This tall, usually attractive, but definitely very scary woman has a thing for preying on young children. And I'm not insinuating that any of these connections were on purpose in regards to RE8's plot, but the writing is on the wall, albeit by accident. And speaking of children, Dracula does have a consistent theme of harm coming to children, specifically the baby that he feeds to the Weird Sisters, the string of children that Lucy Westenra murders. It's not lost on me that Rose in the game is a dismembered baby, but if you really think about it, Ari likes to wield children against us a lot. Lisa Trevor, Evelyn, the baby you find in Donna Beneviento's place, even Mother Miranda's cruelty is spurred by the death of her child. All this to say, the three daughters of Castle Dimitrescu draw an interesting comparison to the three brides of Dracula. They're both related by association, but their time as humans is shrouded in mystery. Both sets of vampires are seductive, talking at length about man-flesh and man-blood, with the Weird Sisters commenting pretty much constantly on how young and fresh they think Jonathan Harker is. And like their Draculaean predecessors, the Dimitrescu sisters have a level of glamour that far exceeds human women. And this might be my own bias talking, I don't know, I think they're hot. But what does all of this mean? The Dracula-Dimitrescu comparisons are low-hanging fruit. You don't need to be a genius, I think, to understand what's going on here. Additionally, the Weird Sisters and the House Dimitrescu sisters mirror each other in interesting ways. There's a lot of tidbits of explanations given for the daughters' existences in the castle, but there seems to be something fundamentally lacking in their presentation. And this is actually my first gripe with RE8. For all the emphasis on Lady Di's obsession with family dynamics, there isn't a motivation as to why she wants to have her daughters in the first place. I guess you can consider them a vessel through which we start to understand what Miranda's been up to, but is this really all they can be employed to do? For example, everybody has seen this portrait of them, but what's in it for Lady Di to have them painted as Rococo human women? Does this imply that there's a period at some point where the Dimitrescus made some kind of effort to appear human, and if so, why? And we'll come back to this, by the way, but they refer to each other within their castle system as mother and sister like the wives of Dracula do. But their creation is the same as the traditional vampires, only the vampire sire is replaced in this case by the Megamycete. And it's certainly interesting. I don't want to talk too much about the nature of their vampiric infection yet, but I think you can see the sort of seeds that are being sown here. So for the third and final time, let's think about the demon and maiden crest. If Dracula is meant to be a story, through the lens of the abused, is Dimitrescu the abuser or the victim? Interesting thought, no? Isn't it fair to say that a sickly woman, tricked into becoming a monster, is cheated out of her birthright as Miranda's heir, and then intentionally killed by her own mother, is a victim herself? Could Dimitrescu's vampirism take on the characteristics of both lenses, an abuser and the victim? I think the tangled and unconventional nature of vampire families lends itself to this murkiness. The strange and unfamiliar makeup of House Dimitrescu in Dracula's castle causes a disconnect in the way that we interpret family. And like critics of Lapin has said, it becomes increasingly difficult to ascertain where human logic belongs in this equation. And that's actually cool, because this is an inhuman family, so why would we want to apply human logic to it anyway? The maiden and demon crest can refer to a handful of different symbolisms: the turning of Alcina into a monster, her role as a demon that turns young women into mindless vampire creatures, or a reference to Bram Stoker's treatment of women in Dracula. It could even represent the way the Megamycete makes monsters of us all. And about that, armchair psychologists have even tried to run the mental circles to say that the women of Dracula represent Stoker's mother's total disregard of her daughter. And I heard about this when researching McNally and Florescu's In Search of Dracula article, because it was mentioned in relation to Lapin. But because this is also a book that people like to dunk on, I'm not about to put my eggs in the Bram Stoker hates women basket. The theory that all of this is Freudian shoehorning holds water in my opinion. The sexy connotation between abusive vampires and their victims have been likened to Freud's seduction theory before, and I think that I'm inclined to agree that the vampire genre does lend itself to such a comparison. But sometimes a scary door is just a scary door, and not everything is about dicking down your dad or whatever. While doing research for the end of this section, I came across something else that was interesting. Takano's interview talks about the general setting of the game, but there is a section in regards to the outside of Castle Dimitrescu where he has this to say, quote, "In the front of the castle you can see bodies that have had their blood drained, looking like skinny scarecrows, and all of them are men. It's a setting in which women are very strong. And this is an interesting monkey wrench in the Dracula theme, especially given all the possible connotations for Dracula's violence against women, and I find myself inclined to agree. This is a setting in which women are very strong. It puts a very much fun twist on the usual vampire fare without becoming sex negative, which genuinely is really refreshing. The women are sexy, but they're also powerful. They lead their own lives, they have their own agendas. For once, the men are treated like accessories. So let's remember the words of Takano's interview. Quote, "Men have their blood drained by these women, so you could say it's the opposite of Dracula." And before you yell at me about reverse sexism with the men as accessories thing, think hard about all of the woman as accessory fiction plots that exist out there and how they've degenerated once solid female characters into born sexy yesterday stereotypes. Harley Quinn, the Weird Sisters, Kaede and Elfin Lied, pretty much every girl in Corpse Party, and we'll get to that in another video. Megan Fox in Transformers, Florence Pugh being naked in Oppenheimer for like 40% of the movie despite being one of the only tangible female characters who talks in this world which seeks to pander rather than uplift women in its media. I find Takano's tongue-in-cheek Dracula retelling refreshing. It's not trying to convince me that the women are sexy objects, and it's not trying to convince me that this is a game made to appeal to women. RE8 is genuinely a woman-centric game. They feel like people. Terrible people, but I rock with it. Now, I've filled your head with all of these connotations to distract you from the fact that there are some insinuations on the cutting room floor of RE8, which the game has the capacity to explore, but for some reason it just won't. I'm connecting the faintest possible dots here to mask the fact that RE8 offers no concrete revelations on Dimitrescu's propensity for family, and how that ties into the story of an evil, deranged, grieving mother. And make no mistake, that is what RE8 is about, and this lack of follow-through on plot points and narrative bothers me, and there's no intellectual unveiling here where I prove to you why it cheapens the plot or why it impacts your gameplay. I just don't like it. I don't like to see characters with intense and immense potential go by the wayside. And I think that this laziness that I perceive is in keeping with the hypothesis that while RE8 is great at setting up all of these ideas, their follow-through comes across as unfinished and hollow. And if you're not picking through the stages that you find these characters in, you may find yourself missing out on interesting plot points. Video games are a narrative. RE has an interesting story to tell on the meditation of death, medicine, grief, transformation, and the human capacity to do evil. So why isn't it telling me that story with these little details that we found being front and center to create a complex social web among the village lords? It feels in RE8 like there is always the insinuation of a connecting narrative that binds us all to the events leading up to Ethan Winter's Eastern European vacation adventure, but I want more than an insinuation. I want RE to fully employ its atmosphere and literary knowledge that they clearly have used to develop the lords, and tell me a fitting, fully fleshed out story about motherhood and grief. And oh my god, is that what this game is about? Well, surprise, surprise, I fooled you. I've made another video essay on motherhood and horror. But seriously, horror is fantastic when you leave the monsters up to the audience's imagination, but too much theorizing and a lack of plot is a bit like taking an SSRI and then jorking it. It's very unsatisfying, and there's no meaningful conclusion. We're doing real stand-up comedy bits here today. But what else is a glaring theme in House Dimitrescu? In my learned aversion to French, I do find that they're capable of two decent things. I love the word for seal, Google it, and a little ditty known as the Seven Wives of Bluebeard. This enduring tale of male cruelty is pretty prolific. There's spin-off novels, a children's animation, and movies like Crimson Peak, which borrow this theme of evil man kills wives until the final girl discovers he's a murderer and then kills him back. The French legend essentially follows a man who, like I said, kills his wives in order to inherit their wealth, and he stashes their body in a room, and his final bride discovers what he's up to thanks to a magical key, which stains itself in blood and eventually outs her to her husband. The tale generally ends with her brothers beheading Bluebeard. This has been interpreted in a ton of different ways, but the gist is that the final wife discovers the corpses of her predecessors in some way or another, and that the husband, the Bluebeard, must die at the end. And I'm very partial to the Crimson Peak framing of Edith bludgeoning wife number 1 with a shovel, if you want to know my personal opinion on that. I was working on this script when I realized halfway through that Dracula does this too. When Lucy becomes a vampire and Mina is next, she's essentially joined the Weird Sisters. If you think of all of them as the brides of Dracula, Mina is the 5th one, almost completing the legend of Bluebeard by a hair. Her involvement in Dracula's life ends up killing him. She's the last wife standing. And the Dimitrescu daughters are once again doing the opposite of their thematic framing here. I can't lie, while it does make me a little giddy for homicidal women to overtake the stereotypes of women in horror being expendable, it is interesting to see RE8 do 2 twist and shouts when you least expect them to. Instead of a woman killing the man who's picking them off, which in this case we'll assume is Ethan, it's him who's removing them one at a time. And I thought that this additional role reversal was a cute little nod to further the literature of Bluebeard. RE8 does a good job of subverting expectations, and it sticks to the general theme of gothic horror, which is incredibly weird when you realize that they're trying to avoid gothic horror in favor of a new, refreshed survival horror look. Yet the very essence of the real life and the fantastically stereotypically scary being merged together is the lifeblood of the RE franchise. True horror is both preternatural and logical. These Venn diagrams can absolutely meet in the middle, and I think that RE does a good job of that. A great fan of RE once described his attraction to the franchise because, quote, "You think it's something supernatural, but it's very scientific. It's viruses and medical experimentation." And do you know what other genre frames human deeds as supernatural phenomenon before they pull the rug out from under you? Gothic horror with a capital H. Themes in literature we've talked about so far tie into the idea that fictional horror mimics life, as it follows the pattern of having a perpetrator and a victim, as framed in a real conflict. If we accept that for every aggressor there is a victim, once we dissect what makes horror unsettling and try to apply logic to it, like Lapin was doing, we might not come to its true essence. But we do find that we can find its emotional effect in actual crime, and that's what makes both the fictional and real life disturbing. They bleed into each other because the human capacity for evil blends fantasy and tangible acts. So what better genre than gothic horror to drive this home? There is always the insinuation of something supernatural, but in gothic horror we're generally unsure if it's really happening. Resident Evil is successfully doing a genre staple. You think it's vampires, but it's just germs. And so now we can finally talk a little bit more about Alcina, and my soul can know peace because we're going to talk about Elizabeth Bathory. And if you know who that is and you're currently vibrating with excitement, you'll be happy to know that Alcina is probably the most #relatable of all the characters ever in RE8 for you true crime fans. I would say that she encapsulates better even than Miranda the core theme of Resident Evil, that disgust and horror comes from human meddling, and zombies are pitiable victims of human evil. And I sure do say the word victim a lot. I wonder if it's a good time to mention the demon and maiden crest again. If you're a storied RE fan, you're probably yelling Lisa Trevor at the screen right now, and it's true. In my opinion, Alcina and Lisa are perfect thematic litmus tests for that genre-defining realist to fantastical horror scale that I was talking about earlier. But they're also glaring proof that Capcom has good ideas for its franchise, and understands how to employ the tribulations of the human psyche in a horror game. And I guess it's fair to say that whenever RE is running from its own thematic significance, it kind of trips and falls back into what it was trying to remix. In this case, their aversion to gothic horror has somehow led them to stumble and fall into a bed of perfect gothic horror. It's almost like an Ouroboros cruise. Lisa Trevor is allegedly based on a real human woman, Junko Furuta. Junko's story is considered one of the worst post-war brutalizings in Japan, and I want to stress that I'm no longer being hyperbolic or trying to be funny. Furuta's abduction, torture, and murder are negligible at best, and she does not deserve to be remembered purely for shock value. Her story is extremely hard to listen to, but for years people have been drawing similarities between her and the character of Lisa Trevor. Lisa Trevor is the first progenitor virus victim. Capable of partially remembering her past, she fuses her parents' faces to her body. She was added to the original Resident Evil remake to add flavor to the mansion's backstory. Its architect was her father, and she and her mother are used for testing and development of the T-virus. The obvious connotation here is that the experimental torture of Lisa and the actual torture of Furuta are being compared. And this is a comparison that, to my knowledge, Capcom hasn't made any efforts to dispel. The fanbase is pretty much married to the theory that both the character and real-life victim have something to do with each other, with Game Grump's assertion of it 7 years ago being front and center in most forums. So again, whether Capcom's intention was to humanize Lisa Trevor for real-life shock value or not, Lisa and Alcina have a slightly more human touch, which makes them relatable and profoundly much more pitiable than other antagonists, like, for example, Nemesis. And this is what makes Mother Miranda so hateable, or what makes Evelyn from RE7 regarded by online forums as, quote, the saddest Resident Evil villain. Children, grieving mothers, victims of crimes, and the very lonely make us second guess our natural aversion to characters who would otherwise be considered terrifying. Instead, in our minds, they become subdued, pitiable, watered down almost. And I originally thought that there was something Bathory-esque about Alcina from the moment it was revealed that she had a castle full of women and liked making wine. Originally, this section was devoted to the purely hypothetical that she was meant to represent Elizabeth Bathory, until I retroactively found out that I was right the whole time. And so now even Dimitrescu's wiki very clearly states that she's based on Bathory. I noticed then, without a doubt, some striking similarities a la Lisa Trevor, reminding us of an actual publicized case of brutality. So consider for the final time the daughters Dimitrescu. Their relationship to each other acts like a tether that creates a whole other non-human character, whose very presence is consistently felt, and we could expound on it forever. The very concept of House Dimitrescu is itself a palpable person, and this is known in Gothic literature as a manifestation of the Italian principle, the spirit of the place, where locations will take on personhood and can act as antagonists without the need for human intervention. The atmosphere or location itself becomes like a human character. Like Lisa Trevor, human brutality and the sensationalization of human suffering takes on a physical form, and that is why Resident Evil is conceptually scary. Begrudgingly, I have to admit, this is kind of a serve on the RE franchise's part. It's very gothic horror, particularly how the spirit of the place is employed to keep us in the mindset of being afraid. The insinuation of a vampire, unveiled to be human meddling, is keeping in line with stories like Jane Eyre or The Fall of the House of Usher. And I'm talking about the original one, because I have a video for you, Mike Flanagan. It presents a ghost or vampire, but unveils at the last possible moment that it's just an estranged, deranged wife in Jane Eyre's case who's being held captive. Or, in the case of The Fall of the House of Usher, the ghost is just the principle of incest. Why do we keep circling back around to incest? So now, Bathory's story is pretty sensationalized, both due to the lack of concrete historic records, but also because once her status as female vampire got footing, she kinda got the Dracula treatment in terms of sensationalization. Elizabeth is hotly debated because some historians believe that her being a serial killer was a fabrication by political rivals, who made bogus evidence and then got servants to produce phony testimonies. But on the other hand, given the light sentencing she received, some historians are pretty certain that she had at least 30 victims, but got off scot-free because she was a noblewoman. And either way, this isn't the time to debate Elizabeth's life story, so let me give you the plot beats people are familiar with. Elizabeth was part of the House of Bathory, owning land in the Kingdom of Hungary, modern Slovakia, and posed a significant threat to the Habsburg Empire. Legend has it her family was full of incredibly deranged warlords. The story that sticks out in my mind is that of her father forcing her to watch as a kid as he stitched a gypsy woman into a live horse. Historic records, words not mine, and let it kick around for a while until the woman and the horse died. Elizabeth's serial killer antics begin, we think, around 1602 to 1604, where lesser gentry sent their daughters to her to learn etiquette, and then the daughters began mysteriously dying. Of the alleged 300 accounts of eyewitness testimony during her trial, ex-servants noted the use of torture by needles and the propensity for bodies to be buried in unmarked graves with signs of inflicted torture. Allegedly. Now, Bathory having bathed in servant girl blood to maintain youth is an accusation that arose after her death, as did many of the vampiric qualities associated with her. Bathory's trial and house arrest, and I'm using that term lightly, happened during a time where even, quote, a stolen chicken would get a vocal letter of complaint, and so it's very strange to historians that the court was never able to produce any kind of written testimony or evidence pertaining to her murderous escapades. And so, for the sake of this video, we'll close her chapter here. You've probably already noticed Dimitrescu's winery. The opening area of the castle has you use an elevator wherein there's baskets of rotting fruit, giving the impression that wine is being made, but in actuality, the Dimitrescus are using blood. Dimitrescu's Sanguis Virginis draws inspiration from Bathory, who supposedly bathed in the blood of virgins. In the actual chamber where the wine is being made, there's body parts and general gore showing very helpfully that the Dimitrescus are eating people. And did you also notice that the scarecrows outside are men, while the horribly mutated women you find in the castle are exclusively female servants? RE8 has stayed very close to the source material here. The Dimitrescus prey on female servants, while the quote-unquote man blood in their carcasses are meant to ward off outsiders. The fact that the servant girls mutate into horrible zombie creatures is like a Bathory-esque tall tale, and I appreciate the attention to detail in littering the castle with allusions to maids being killed for slight misgivings. There's even a diary entry you can find where a maid hears moaning in the halls, theorizing it's the restless spirits of the servant girls. Little does she know that it's the actual zombified servants, and I think that the moaning in the halls might also be another fun little nod to the fall of the House of Usher. You really get to experience this in the Maiden demo, which is a really cool concept. You not only get to see the pools of blood, but the torture devices and various bits of maids long past, with a convenient note detailing that you, Ingrid the Maiden, are certainly next. It's a little odd that Ingrid's name shows up with the three daughters in Miranda's experiment notes, but she appears in the demo after Bella, Cassandra, and Daniela have already been sired. I guess it's not impossible that the names on that list have nothing to do with the three daughters, but if that's the case, then it kind of leaves a big plot hole where the explanation for Alcina's daughters should go. The wiki refers to the maiden as Ingrid, even going so far as to say the main game references her as a mutant being, unstable, overly alert at times. I found this note and I immediately said, oh, okay, so this must be where the three daughters come from. That's kind of fun. But now that I've played the Maiden demo, I'm not so sure because we're technically presented with 4 names but 3 daughters. You get to experience the Dimitrescu family winery business and conveniently die at the end as Ingrid, so we don't really have to agonize too much about you in a video essay. I've seen rumblings online that suggest that the opposite is true, that the men have been used for their blood to make the wine and the women have simply been turned into moroicas, otherwise known as female vampires, experimented on by Alcina and Miranda, but honestly, with the heavy-handed metaphors that RE8 gives us in Takano's interview, I don't think that this is explicitly true. Other than that, there are obviously always little notes left around each location to give you some insight into the village's lords and what they're up to. There isn't much we haven't already covered, but the notes did irk me as a mechanic. I think that the team could have put more emphasis on showing rather than telling, and I have some nifty ideas as to how. Alcina Dimitrescu is a pretty well-rounded character. It's obvious a lot of love and care went into siring her. Get it? She's oddly sympathetic, and this might be my chronically ill bias talking, but I think she encompasses the central theme of Resident Evil, as mentioned before, she's a victim of circumstances, where the most supernatural thing about her is straight-up medical abuse. Alcina suffers from porphyria cutanea tarda, an actual condition that causes lesions and painful blisters to appear on people's skin when exposed to the sun, and this condition is thought to be the original observable trait which led to the mythologization of vampires. Alcina's story is objectively relatable. As a chronically ill person with rare and impossible to treat genetic diseases, I totally get it. Her motivation makes a lot of sense. She's lured under the castle by Mother Miranda in her 40s, but there's little reason given as to why. We have to piece it together based on context clues. So by the time she's back, the timeline of her life places her around post-World War II, where nobility has been abolished in her area and her jazz career, yes, I'm serious, is in the toilet. I'm not, that's not like a bit. Google it. Isn't it logical to say that sick Alcina, without many options, would be lured perhaps by the promise of a new and improved body, and on top of that, some nifty new social status as a lord? If your body was failing you and somebody promised to have the answers to alleviate the fear of a painful disease-ridden death, wouldn't you want to hear them out? There's an emphasis on the Great War causing actionable change in the village's lordship, primarily in the abolishment of nobility. It's implied that Donna's parents literally off themselves because of this social shift. And so now, perhaps Alcina creates her daughters because she has nobody else, or perhaps the change threatens to destroy her very way of life. And this is a viable solution. The daughters are considered in her diary entries as loyal extensions of Miranda's kindness towards her. She wants to be Miranda's favorite because she sees the world in terms of castes, those that are in the out group and beneath her, and the one woman she strives to please. Mother Miranda is regarded with reverence. Lady Di structures her house as a family because it's revealed in her diary that she sees the lordships as an adopted unit, something that the other lords don't necessarily bother to do, or at least they don't talk outwardly about it non-stop like she does. There's emphasis placed on Lady Di wanting to be the favorite child. She strives for Miranda's love and favoritism in a very Lapin-esque way. Connection is on the forefront of this creature's mind, as it is on the forefront of Lisa Trevor's mind. One of the most common takeaways in horror is, love makes monsters of us all. So in this case, love has literally turned Dimitrescu into a monster. The most interesting description of the daughters is also in relation to babies. We find it in Lady Di's diary. A fun juxtaposition with Rose. When her daughters awaken, she describes her expressions as being, quote, like newborns. She watches the blowflies transform into them, gestating like a pregnancy. She names them. She wears 3 roses on her dress to represent them. She has them painted as beautiful human women. And she tells Ethan in her quest to kill him that it's in retribution for him murdering her kids. In the end, she even forgoes Miranda's plans in favor of exacting revenge for her daughters. And from what little detail we're given about the siring of the sisters, it's clearly framed somewhat like a pregnancy is unfolding. Alcina, at least in her own mind, might be a monster, but she's a monster who loves. And so wouldn't it make sense to give us more context as to how or why she sired her daughters, and maybe even what made them appealing as victims? Isn't that kind of the next logical question? Ari is going to great lengths here to drill it into your head that Dimitrescu has quasi-human emotions and motivations. She's one of the only zombie mutants who feels genuine connection among her house. It's actually weirdly heartwarming, and it made me like House Dimitrescu a lot more while I was doing the research. I felt kind of sad killing her in the end. I thought that she deserved better. But now, you've probably noticed that I keep talking about illusions in the gothic horror genre being something that RE isn't going for, but rather stumbled into. And RE8's art director, Tonomori Takano, stated in his interview that, quote, he felt that just doing a gothic aesthetic would be a bit lacking in originality, which is why he wanted to add a modern idea to that premise. And this is in relation to Lady Dimitrescu. He talks about using Audrey Hepburn and the Addams Family as inspiration for her fashion, in order to, quote, use these sources as hints to create a less conventional gothic setting. But if you're an astute viewer, you've probably already noticed that RE arguably did not reinvent some kind of less conventional goth wheel. If anything, they tripped and fell into a more conventionally gothic horror premise than ever imaginable. I have a theory as to how they went wrong, and I believe it's due to a misunderstanding of the genre. Considering the reference materials used, most specifically Dracula, you're setting up your characters to exist in a somewhat astringent context. And while it is true that vampire media nowadays has gone the way of being remixed to hell and back, we find the core of the vampire story often plays on the same plot beats. There are genre staples for a reason. There's always some kind of longing, regret, found family, and a general meditation on siring new vampires and what that means for their immortal souls. Sometimes there's more of a sexual overtone, sometimes there's more of an emphasis on agape, but often there is a quasi-body horror that follows, if not full-on transformation of a man into a beast. Even, say, The Addams Family was based on Victorian mansions and graveyards as described by Charles Addams growing up in Westfield, New Jersey. RE8 has pigeonholed themselves before even coming out of the gate, and I think it's especially interesting when you look at pre-production, as the exclusion of Miranda for a cult-run shantytown controlled by a pastor is in and of itself a Gothic staple. It's very Southern Gothic. The characters we're going to see moving forward are all rooted in suspiciously gothic horror-esque themes, and sometimes they leave very little room for interpretation outside the norms of that genre. Look at this section alone. How many times have we made direct comparisons to Gothic literature, specifically Dracula, which is one of the titans of the genre? But RE8's disappointment does not only come from the misunderstanding of a popular genre, it also derives frustration from the way that we're meant to interact with our environment. And here's where I break my cardinal rule, because we are going to talk a little bit about gameplay mechanics. So, for starters, I absolutely hated the way they foiled the depth of their characters by spoon-feeding us lore via notes and diaries. The note system fell flat for me because the landscapes and location in this game are so beautiful and add a perfect layer of immersion with rich colors and complex textures. So imagine my shock when they introduced this find the scrapbook pages mechanic to surmise what's going on plot-wise. One of the artistic directors, Morimasa Sato, literally said that, quote, the approach was of starting with the characters and building an experience from there. So if that's true, then why am I playing Post-it Note Collection Simulator? Doesn't it feel like the cardinal sin of showing and not telling? Shouldn't there be something else, like the inherent intelligence you think that your audience has, that may steer us helpfully in the right direction, just through set dressing? I noticed during my playthrough that the castle has a very rich atmosphere. The tub full of blood, the underground torture chamber and lab, the remnants of Miranda's testing on the servants. The blood writing is a little silly, and it felt out of place, but I'll give it a half point because, yeah, it could be a great environmental detail. I even found this little note that, like I mentioned before, may explain the daughters and tell us their real names, Irina, Mihaela, and Lois. And this is an objectively interesting find. You can infer using your brain cells what's going on simply by completing the wine bottle puzzle. And I would even argue that the cook's diary entry is redundant, since you're passing through the kitchen, which is covered in human remains anyway when you come out of the cellar. And you notice the lack of castle staff. This is a very empty castle. You're inclined to understand the environment that you've walked into. In the first fight with Bella, you notice right away that the night air weakens her. This could have just been a revealed mechanic without the cook's diary entry being needed at all. And if you want to lean even further into the Dracula allegory, in Stoker's original novel, Jonathan Harker realizes that it's the Count who's been doing all the castle's chores. Because he doesn't have a staff, he's been making the bed, making dinner, and serving tea. Castle Dimitrescu is a huge, rotting, fantastically empty structure with no staff to be spoken of. In Dracula, Jonathan figures it out by hiding and watching the Count literally setting the table for dinner one night, and that could have been a fun Ethan Winters cutscene. Now, I'm not opposed to finding information on paper as a plot device. I actually really like it. It's one of my favorite parts of horror, the big reveal after combing through an archive. Crimson Peak does this really well, with Edith discovering the diary of her husband's murdered wife and coming to terms with what's been going on in the Sharp estate with the help of some ghouls and some phonographs. But I would argue that RE8 is taking an easy way out. You find a variety of information from a variety of people, like the chambermaid, the cook, and then Lady Di's diary, but the environmental storytelling suffers a hit because you're being spoon-fed information as opposed to exploring a vast and honestly pretty creepy castle. The ambient noises of doors opening, women breathing, and footsteps in the distance genuinely kept making me turn around with my little stabby knife because I thought I was about to get murdered. Resident Evil games do a great job of imparting a sense of foreboding. When I was wandering the village in the beginning and I saw grass just like rustling around, I actually said out loud, I don't want to go in there. The music, the atmosphere, the ambient noises, the low lighting, and the risk of a Dimitrescu turning up in the castle lends itself to you being jumpy and nervous. So why not employ this brilliant atmosphere to be a vessel for context? I think the fight with the daughters and Lady Di herself could have been made that much better by employing the various parts of the castle more. I thought the castle being extremely empty only to suddenly encounter the weird sisters gave the level an unfinished feel. Since there are 4 Dimitrescus, RE8 could have better employed the space, assigning one lore-heavy area of the house to each. You could begin in the castle, encounter Bella as you do in the cellar, albeit a little bit more expansive of a cellar, journey below to the crypt and learn of the girl's creation, maybe glean some information on Miranda, fight off Daniela, and finally, having found the wine bathing room, fight off Cassandra. Then, having seen her daughters are all dead, and you've revealed the truth about the castle, you could show down with Dimitrescu. Wouldn't it have been fun to comb through every inch of a perverse winery, progressively getting more and more off-kilter, until you fall through the floor into a torture chamber and come out of the gory kitchen? The cook's note is not necessarily a bad clue. It gives the impression that small offenses by the castle staff lead directly to their demise. It's an excellent complement to fighting the daughters off in a winery covered in blood, and it makes us think of Elizabeth Bathory. And so, RE8 really does accomplish all of its goals here. But I think if you happen upon remains, perhaps even human women half transformed into bloodsuckers after being turned into wine, cognizant enough to provide exposition, this might be a more interesting vessel through which we understand the plot. While you do rifle through the environment and happen on context clues, the way in which you interact with the environment feels secondary to the fighting. For example, the crypt below. You get the impression Miranda's experimenting because of the random medical equipment and the obviously turned women roaming around. But what if you walk through the room where the daughters were turned and discover for yourself what Lady Di did to those girls? If there was just a hair more visual interest and integration of the family dynamic in the castle's design, then maybe some input into why the sisters were created at all might be found. Speaking of visual interest, I got annoyed while combing through the whole game that a lot of recycled textures appear. It's not the biggest deal, but since we're doing Note Collection Simulator, it would be fun if the pictures in the frames had some differences. Maybe snapshots of days long past, pictures of Miranda doing various rituals, Dimitrescu as a human. In the crypt, there could have been more evidence of Bella, Cassandra, and Daniela having been held there. The ledger also mentions again Ingrid, who's unstable. You could, in this game, create a prison cell where a struggle has clearly taken place in order to get across the fact that Ingrid's been experimented on. Maybe even you fight the insatiable Ingrid in a place where the walls are covered in evidence of the sisters' time as humans, Dimitrescu's ledger of their creation conveniently being left ajar. Ingrid would make a great mini-boss, and the place in which you find her would make for great setting-based context clues. Notice also how this is the second instance we glean of Miranda's meddling. If you look at the pictures in the houses when the lichens attack, they all have framed images of Miranda, but again, the texture is always exactly the same, and so you're looking at this perfectly framed little Blender Miranda stock character model. It feels very weird, and not in a horror game way, in a lazy way. In the crypt, there's repeated textures of stock photos of skulls, which is pretty boring. I think that we could have done some better set dressing here. Castle Dimitrescu is the first glimpse we get into Miranda using the village as a testing ground. that being the maids in the dungeon. So here's another question. Why is the aesthetic of the Weird Sisters so different from Lady Di? If we look closely at them, don't they kind of remind you of somebody? Somebody who is also wearing black and obscuring her face? This is an interesting visual cue. It implies, visually, that the daughters are not an extension of Lady Di, but rather of Miranda, and so the question becomes, why create them at all? Is this a Miranda experiment, as Lady Di's diary confirms, or is this an Alcina experiment? Is she lonely? Is this a marriage of convenience? These are interesting questions, and I feel that you could do a lot of pick and mixing with them in order to make the castle feel like what it is, a blurred vortex of Dimitrescu's desires and Miranda's experimentation. These changes, albeit small, would correct the frustrating way in which you find context that could easily be overlooked if you're not literally combing through every inch of the map, which the reason that I found allusions at all is because I combed through, you guessed it, every single inch of the map. When I was first laying out my plans for this section, somebody brought up a good point. There aren't very many ways necessarily to retell a vampire story in an Eastern European backwoods town. And there may not be very many ways to connect the theming of vampires to the RE franchise, but I don't think that that's correct. Resident Evil Biohazard introduces us to the Baker family amidst Dulvey County, Louisiana, and do you know what else Louisiana is absolutely known for? That's right, it's vampires, and you interview with the vampire fans are probably levitating in excitement right now, because I can very easily envision a world where RE8 was set in New Orleans, and there could absolutely have been vampires. We even have had House Dimitrescu, led by a jazz-singing Lady Di. It works against the New Orleans backdrop thanks to the tale of the Carter brothers. They were allegedly caught when one of their victims escaped and made a run for the streets of New Orleans. When the police were led back to their home, they found women tied up, bleeding from wounds around major sources of blood, and when the police later ambushed them, the brothers begged to be murdered as they admitted they were vampires. When their dead bodies were eventually checked on after their sentencing, the tomb was found to be empty. And while we're avoiding gothic horror, imagine the air quotes there, let's talk about H.P. Lovecraft's Pickman's model. About a vampire who is possessed by the mold and perpetually experimenting on people he captures in order to understand more about himself. Maybe he pulls an Evelyn and makes an entire family of horribly mutated mistakes for Ethan Winters to find and defeat. That's very Pickman model-esque. Can you imagine, amidst the backdrop of a rotting and derelict French quarter, that one of those past estates could be home to a family of Cadeaux bearing bloodsuckers? It even works since Cadeaux sounds a bit like cadeau or gift in French. You're welcome, Capcom, I'll give you that one for free. Powers of the mold, megamycete, and in general the happenings surrounding the T-virus infections are pretty storied at this point in the games. We have a general knowledge of how it works, and RE8 spends more time than you think explaining it through various characters. The most obvious one that you're probably thinking of being Miranda, but one that I really want to talk about because I think she's the most significant example of pushing the megamycete superpowers to their logical extreme is Donna Beneviento. But consider Lady Di. She's able to turn her daughters into blood-sucking zombie vampires. Why? Does it imply that the genetic disorder that she has, or even the genetic diseases in general, can be passed on through infection? And if Miranda gave her daughters, as she claimed, the ability to be sired, then why did so many of the other women who had their blood drained become mindless creatures? If the daughters had an affinity towards Cadeaux, it's not just any Cadeaux that transforms them. The wiki specifically says that Alcina sires them. And so how do you pass on a blood disorder? Does that not imply that Cadeaux can corrupt or even kill itself should the wrong kind of infection attempt to be passed on? And on the other hand, given what we're going to get into with Donna Beneviento, would it be fair to say that the megamycete, the heart of the virus that can remember and store information as a hive mind, remembers that Lady Di has a blood disorder and could potentially infect other unrelated people with vampire zombification? These questions raise interesting concerns about the capabilities of the megamycete and add more credence to the vampire legend of the sire both being a reproduction and possible mating ritual. By birthing a host of vampire daughters who are not biologically related to you, you're also kind of biologically reproducing with them at the same time in this instance. It's like having a kid with your kid. Was Lapin onto something? And so we find ourselves at the psychosexual intersection of why we're attracted to vampires, moreover, why we're attracted to the Dimitrescus. My answer is pretty simple. I think that they're just attractive. I think that's the whole point. They made big, hot, scary ladies because people love thick goth girls and we're in the business of selling games. I don't think RE8 takes its vampiric connotations too seriously because the theming here is borrowed. Although we've used the word retelling throughout this video, in reality I don't think that this game is trying to do a true retelling of anything, and I won't fault them for that. This is a franchise based on zombies. Capcom is not branching out into the gothic horror franchise, at least not intentionally. The cyclical nature of the vampire sire, which serves as a means of creating a child and a mate, lends itself, I think, to a franchise whose bread and butter is, after all, body horror. And make no mistake, I am a bloodhound for finding out when a game is trying to meditate on the nature of consent. Like, I'm obsessed with Bloodborne for a reason. But I think that the Lapin-driven desire to see vampires for more than what they are is a bit of a Freudian slip on the part of all humans. Vampires at their inception were ghosts, not long-fanged, sexy fly-by-night men, but rather apparitions which during their transience from life to death could become unclean and visit the living to drink their blood, murder them, cause plagues, or otherwise inflict pestilence. And it's thanks to immigration that the story of the Upir was brought to the UK and popularized to be embellished as a vampire story so that we could later have sparkling haunted teenage boy vampires of today. The emphasis on family, and specifically on mother-daughter relationships, is the corner of RE8. Again, this is a female-led narrative by design. Ethan Winters feels almost out of place among the central women of the plot, and I think that that's the point. He's catapulted into the world of Miranda, the Dimitrescus, of Donna. It's a world which is unfamiliar and run by unknowable and punctuatedly deranged women. The emphasis in game is on Mother Miranda, who's created this strange family as she seeks to rebirth a surrogate daughter. Resident Evil, the franchise, has long relied on women to further the in-game story. Lisa Trevor, Evelyn, Miranda, Sherry Birkin, Claire Redfield, to name a few. I have to take my hat off to Capcom as a feminist who enjoys video games, because they treat female characters as more than just fodder. There's a genuine reverence that I feel playing RE8, a celebration of the juxtaposing brutality of female identity. The mother perverted, the daughter perverted, the female urge to nurse becomes the female urge to sire. Vampires are sexy, but not just in a death by snoo-snoo way. They're also objectively terrifying, cannibalistic, unsettling, parasitical against the backdrop of this girly opulence. It's a fun reverse trope, and it boldly questions the role of women in video games. While I do have beef with the world building in RE8, and this video is part of a series, and so we still have a ways to go about that, I can absolutely celebrate it for its diverse cast of villains. Villainry which revolves around the feminine is often the most poignant and scary kind of horror because as humans we have rigid preconceived notions of what makes a woman a woman. We're made a little uncomfortable, if not completely scandalized, by what we perceive to be a perversion of the natural order. But I'm of the opinion that the woman is the most brutal creature in nature. In most animal species, the women's colors are subdued. They wait around for mates, for the men to prove themselves to them. They do the hunting, the feeding, the raising of the babies. Some mammals even change their primary sex characteristics to mimic male counterparts in the absence of male leadership. And if you've ever been a woman fighting for a place at a table inhabited exclusively by men, you've probably had to change something about yourself in order to appear less feminine and become accepted by the pride. The notion of the not like other girls girl is not an accident. Society demonizes femininity inherently because it's often seen as frivolous or dispensable. Women go in search of authority by casting off their femininity lest they be othered by the men they need to acclimate to in order to have successful careers, relationships, and educations. And these attitudes spill over into the media that we create and consume. We are products of a sexist society. It's nice to have RE8's primary antagonists be women. It's refreshing to see escapist media embrace the volatility of femininity, because not all women are Jane Eyres. Some of them are Elizabeth Bathory. And there is something valuable in horror about the mother role perverted into the serial killer fantasy. There's not a lick of codependence on hysteria to show that a woman is dangerous in RE8. She simply is, and I think that that's an interesting premise. It's something that we don't really question with male characters, and so I think that it does warrant a gold star for being applied to female characters. And this is where I leave you to ponder on your own. As mentioned, this is part of a series, so the next lord on the chopping block is Donna Beneviento, who is my personal favorite. I'm excited to explore this theme of motherhood in relation to RE8, and I'm especially excited to talk about the theming of horror and dolls. Especially in the context of femininity and perversion, I think that dolls are conceptually employed in interesting ways, which is my way of telling you we're going to be talking about Bloodborne again. And so we've reached the end of our meditation on Castle Dimitrescu. I think that RE8 does warrant celebration for its bold stance on showing the volatility of women simply by virtue of being women. I like a big scary goth girl antagonist, genuinely. I think that this is certainly a game where if you want to go looking for illusions as I have, you could find them, although I do find it ironic how the developers insist that allusions to one of the most enduring literary genres of human history are not there when they're so clearly like staring you right in the face. In any case, I hope that you're able to replay the game and perhaps glean a sense of renewed enjoyment. Resident Evil is nostalgic for me because it's always been on the periphery of my childhood, but because I'm not big on zombies, I was never really given the opportunity to get into it until they introduced vampires. It's a franchise which exists in the back of my mind, and it's been interesting to revisit it as an adult. RE8 has helped me overcome my fear of body horror, honestly, and to come to terms with my own semi-mutilated self post-cancer and post-resectioning. For the first time as an adult, I can look into the theme of medical horror and not be made uncomfortable or repulsed. I see myself in it, and so I love this emphasis on female power throughout RE8 because it's really refreshed my take on media, and for this, despite my criticisms, I have to thank Capcom. For the first time, I have to like Resident Evil, or dislike Resident Evil by the end of this series, on my own, without my thoughts being colored by the fans of the franchise who exist in my life. And there's something really special about going looking for details in the plot of a game which is meant to be silly, violent fun. I really did enjoy making this video. I enjoyed revisiting the script a year later to see how my opinions had developed and grown, and I'm excited to continue the series because I think that there is something to be said about the nuances of the Resident Evil franchise. I'm excited to go archaeologically looking for them because I do think that there's the potential to unveil something really special here. But we can't jump the gun quite yet because I don't want to reveal too much in this video without first covering my personal favorite character, Donna Beneviento, and so unfortunately, my lovelies, this is indeed where I leave you. But first, a very special shout out to the patrons, new and old, hi, who make these videos possible. I love you, mwah, mwah, mwah. Welcome in, welcome in. Thank you to Ace, Ori, Noop, Blake, Andrea, Not a Necro Wizard, Delta Animations, Addie, Kat, Gwen, Big Monkey, and Leo. If you want to check out the free tier of Patreon, please do subscribe. You get a lot of free goodies and some exclusive looks at YouTube content ahead of it going up. Check me out on Instagram too if you want just the art, and if you enjoy hearing me yap, please consider heading to my second channel. I do vlogs and AMAs by request. If you like subjecting me to reading vampire incest novels, swingle that bwingle and coingle that boingle, like, comment, and survive, and I'll see you guys real soon. Stay weird!